The forest felt alive the moment we stepped past the tree line. Not alive in the comforting, natural way forests usually are, but alive in the sense of something watching, something aware. The air hung heavier here, tinged with the faint smell of damp moss and decay, and every step we took seemed to echo in a way that felt unnatural. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, its cone of light barely illuminating the ground ahead, as though the shadows themselves were swallowing it. The map in my hand trembled, not from the cold, but because I couldn't stop shaking. The symbols scribbled across its surface, looping in an angular, felt like they were staring back at me. I shouldn't have brought us here. I knew that now, but something about the email I'd received had gnawed at me, a compulsion I couldn't shake. I'd convinced myself it was curiosity, but it felt like something darker, something more personal. Behind me, the others moved in uneasy silence. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a branch. Ryan walked just a step behind, his breathing quick and shallow. Zoe was further back, her flashlight darting in wide arcs, as though she expected something to leap out at her. Mason, our guide, led the way. He hadn't spoken since we'd passed the first set of symbols carved into the trees, but his tension was palpable. He knew more than he'd let on. Let's ma. The first sign of the ritual site was subtle, a cluster of charred stones scattered across the forest floor, forming a crude, broken circle. My flashlight lingered on them, illuminating the blackened edges and the faint traces of what looked like dried red stains. A chill crept up my spine. I knew. The map hadn't mentioned this. The trees began to thin, and ahead, I saw it. A clearing, illuminated faintly by the pale light of the moon filtering through the canopy. At its center stood a crooked structure, half hidden by overgrowth. The air seemed colder here, the stillness oppressive. My footsteps slowed, hesitation pulling at me, but something inside drove me forward. The house, or what was left of it, loomed before us, its roof caved in, its windows hollow and empty like dead eyes. The doorway was ajar, the wood warped and splintered. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. Emilune. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating like a gunshot in the silence. My flashlight illuminated the interior. A single large room, its floor covered in debris. The walls were stained and cracked, and the faint scent of ash lingered in the air. Symbols covered every surface, carved deep into the wood. Yet they weren't random. Each one seemed purposeful, deliberate, their shapes sharp and angular, as though the act of creating them had been violent. In the center of the room was a table. And this silvering was scribble. It was old, its surface rough and uneven, but something about it felt deliberate, like it had been placed there for a purpose. Resting on top of the table was a bowl, its edges lined with what looked like dried wax or resin. Symbols etched into its surface matched those on the walls. their lines dark and jagged. The whispers started as soon as we stepped inside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, slipping through the cracks in the rotted wood. But then I realized the sound was coming from within the room, low and faint, like voices just out of reach. The air grew colder, and a pressure settled over my chest, making it hard to breathe. My flashlight flickered, the beam faltering, and for a moment, the room was plunged into darkness. When the light returned, the symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their lines no longer static but writhing, twisting into new shapes. My heart pounded, and I stumbled back, colliding with Mason. He didn't move, his eyes locked on the table. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and his flashlight hung limply at his side. This isn't right, he muttered, his voice barely audible. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, their words incomprehensible but heavy with intent. The bowl on the table began to shake, rattling against the wood. The symbols carved into it glowed faintly, a sickly red light that pulsed in time with the whispers. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn and flee, to leave this cursed place behind. But my feet were rooted to the floor, my breath shallow and uneven. The bowl stopped shaking. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment the room was still. And then the ground beneath us trembled. The table splintered with a deafening crack, the bowl shattering into pieces. Shivers. From the cracks in the floorboards, a thick black smoke began to rise, curling and twisting like living tendrils. The air grew colder still, the temperature plummeting to an unbearable chill that made my breath fog in front of me. The smoke pooled in the center of the room, writhing and coalescing, taking on a form that was both there and not, its edges blurred and shifting. It rose higher, towering over us, its presence oppressive and suffocating. The shadows around it seemed to stretch and warp, pulling toward it, like it was drawing the darkness into itself. My flashlight flickered again, its beam barely cutting through the thick blackness. My chest tightened, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure, from the void where its face should have been. The whispers returned, louder now, their tone sharp and commanding. They weren't just voices. They words, a language I couldn't understand, but felt in the depths of my mind. Mason stumbled back, his voice rising in panic. We shouldn't have come here. We shouldn't have. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It didn't glide. It just shifted faster than my eyes could follow, its form dissolving and reappearing closer to us. I froze, my limbs refusing to obey the primal urge to flee. The whispers grew deafening, their chaotic tones drilling into my skull. And then the lights went out. The darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive, pressing against me like a living, breathing thing. My flashlight clicked uselessly as I tried to reignite it. The faint metallic sound swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed the whispers. My breathing quickened, each inhale sharp and shallow, as though the air itself was thinning. "Stay close," I whispered, my voice trembling in the void. I reached out blindly, my fingers brushing against something. Mason's arm. His muscles were taut, his entire body trembling under my touch. And I couldn't tell if he was trying to steady me or himself. And that to lay himself. Then the sound came. Not the whispers. Those had been replaced by something worse. A low, guttural noise, like the creaking of ancient wood, mixed with a distant growl. It echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, and the weight of it pressed down on my chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was a warning. The floor beneath us shifted, the wood groaning, as if under immense pressure. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but nothing in the rational world could account for what I was feeling. The air vibrated with energy, an invisible force that prickled against my skin like static electricity. A dim red glow began to seep through the cracks in the floorboards, casting the room in a sinister light. It wasn't the warm, comforting hue of firelight, but something colder, more deliberate. The symbols on the walls, once faint and static, now pulsed with the same eerie light, their lines writhing like living things. "Ellie," Mason said, his voice breaking the silence. It wasn't just fear I heard. It was desperation. "We have to leave. Now." I wanted to agree, to turn and run, but the red glow pulled at me, drawing my gaze downward. Beneath the shattered floorboards, I could see it, something moving in the shadows below. Tendrils of darkness coiled and writhed, reaching upward as though they were alive, straining against the cracks in the wood. Before I could react, the floor splintered beneath us with a deafening crack. The ground gave way, and I fell. The descent felt endless. My arms flailed, grasping for anything to hold on to. But there was nothing but air. The red glow surrounded me, growing brighter and brighter until it was all I could see. My stomach lurched as I landed hard on something cold and solid, the impact jarring but not enough to knock me unconscious. For a moment, I couldn't move. My ears rang, and every inch of my body ached. Slowly, I forced myself to sit up, my hands pressing against the cold, smooth surface beneath me. It wasn't wood or stone. It was something else entirely, something that hummed faintly under my touch. The light around me dimmed, and I realized I was no longer in the house. The space I had landed in was vast, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above. The walls were lined with the same writhing symbols, their red light pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. The air was colder here, heavy with the metallic tang of blood, and something else I couldn't place. "Ellie?" Zoe's voice echoed from somewhere to my left, weak and trembling. "I'm here," I called back, my voice breaking. I turned toward the sound and saw her lying a few feet away, her flashlight miraculously still clutched in her hand. Its beam flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space around her. Ryan and Mason were nearby, both struggling to their feet. Mason's face was pale, his eyes wide as they darted around the room. This isn't possible, he muttered, his voice hollow. We were in the house. How did we? The question hung in the air, unanswered. None of us had an explanation, and the oppressive weight of the place made it clear we wouldn't find one. This wasn't just a hidden basement or a forgotten room. This was something older, something deeper. The ground beneath us trembled, a faint vibration that sent ripples through the air. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, their red glow casting jagged shadows that seemed to move on their own. The sound returned, that low guttural noise, growing louder and more insistent. Zoe scrambled to her feet, her flashlight beam darting around the room. We have to get out of here, she said, her voice shaking. Whatever this is, we can't stay. Mason pointed toward an opening in the far wall. A narrow archway carved from the same strange material as the floor. There, he said, his voice steadier now, though his hands still trembled. It's the only way. We moved as a group, our footsteps hesitant and uneven as we crossed the chamber. The air grew colder with every step, the vibration beneath us growing stronger. The archway loomed closer, its edges jagged and uneven, the symbols carved into it glowing brighter as we approached. As we passed through, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our footsteps, but they grew louder with each step, their tones sharp and commanding. The corridor ahead twisted and turned, its walls narrowing until we were forced to walk single file. I led the way, my flashlight beam flickering weakly against the smooth, dark walls. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of sound that made my head throb. I pressed forward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on me. The corridor opened into another chamber, smaller than the first, but no less strange. At its center stood a pedestal, rough and uneven, its surface covered in jagged carvings. Resting on top of it was a small, circular object, a disc, its surface smooth and reflective, etched with the same glowing symbols that adorned the walls. None of us spoke. The air in the room was heavy, thick with a sense of anticipation. The whispers quieted, their chaotic tones replaced by a single steady hum that seemed to emanate from the disc itself. I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I reached out toward the object. The symbols on its surface pulsed faintly, their light growing brighter as my fingers brushed against it. The moment I touched it, the room erupted in light. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into my chest. The walls around us seemed to shift and ripple, the symbols glowing brighter and brighter, until they were all I could see. And then the world fell away. The light faded slowly, peeling back like layers of a curtain, leaving only a faint afterimage burned into my vision. My breath hitched, each inhale sharp and dry, the air around me thinner and colder than before. When I blinked away the lingering brightness, I realized I was no longer in the narrow chamber. The others were there, but the space around us had shifted, warped into something impossibly vast and endless. The ground beneath us was smooth and dark, like polished obsidian, but it pulsed faintly under my feet, as though it was alive. The faint red glow of the symbols was gone, replaced by something deeper, a dim, shifting light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air hummed with an unnatural vibration, so low and constant that it crawled under my skin. "Where are we?" Zoe's voice trembled, breaking the suffocating silence. She stood a few feet away, clutching her flashlight like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The beam was useless here, swallowed by the dark expanse that stretched endlessly around us. I didn't answer. My mind raced, struggling to process what I was seeing. But there was no logic here, no framework to understand. This wasn't just a place. It was a presence, something ancient and incomprehensible that pressed against me from all sides. Mason took a shaky step forward, his boots barely making a sound against the glass-like surface. It can't be real," he muttered, his voice hollow. "None of this makes sense." Ryan was quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon, or where the horizon should have been. There was no end to this place, no boundary, just the endless void, stretching in every direction. The only features were faint ripples in the surface beneath us, spiraling out like cracks in frozen water, converging toward a single point far ahead. And at that center, something moved. It wasn't like the shadows from before. Those had been erratic, chaotic. This was deliberate. A figure loomed in the distance, tall and formless, its edges blurred and shifting, as though it were part of the void itself. It didn't move closer, but its presence filled the space, oppressive and consuming, pulling my attention like a magnet. Zoe clutched my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "Ellie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that?" I didn't know how to answer. The figure wasn't just a shape. It was a feeling, a crushing weight that settled in my chest and made it hard to breathe. It was as if the void itself had taken form, given life by the whispers that still echoed faintly in my ears. The ground trembled beneath us, the vibrations growing stronger. The ripples in the surface deepened, cracks forming and spreading outward like veins, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The air grew colder, biting against my skin, and the hum around us grew louder, more insistent. "We need to move," Mason said, his voice sharp but strained. "I don't know what that thing is, but it's not waiting for us to figure it out." I nodded, my legs stiff and unsteady as I forced myself forward. Each step felt wrong, the surface beneath me shifting subtly, like walking on ice that could shatter at any moment. The others followed, their movements cautious, their breaths visible in the freezing air. As we moved, the figure remained distant but unyielding, its form growing clearer with every step. It wasn't humanoid, not entirely. Its shape was fluid, its edges rippling like smoke, but it stood tall and solid, radiating a presence that felt ancient and vast. The whispers grew louder as we approached, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head throb. The cracks beneath us spread further, the green light bleeding through in jagged lines. The ground shifted violently, and I stumbled, catching myself just before falling. Zoe cried out, her flashlight slipping from her grip and clattering onto the surface. The beam flickered once, then went dark. Mason helped her to her feet, his own hands trembling. Envelop, tu, viu, trembling. This place is falling apart, he said, his voice tight with panic. We have to get out of here. There's nowhere to go, Ryan said, his voice low and distant. His gaze was fixed ahead, his expression unreadable. It's pulling us toward it. We're not in control anymore. Hey, his words sent a chill through me, deeper than the cold air around us. I knew he was right. Every step forward felt less like a choice and more like inevitability, as though the figure ahead was drawing us in, bending the very fabric of this place to its will. The cracks beneath us widened, the green light intensifying until it cast eerie shadows across our faces. The air was thick with energy, vibrating with a frequency that rattled my teeth. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears, as we drew closer to the center. And then we were there. The figure loomed before us, its form massive and undefined, its edges shifting like oil on water. It had no face, no features, but its presence was overwhelming, filling every corner of the void with a weight that made it hard to stand. The whispers reached a crescendo, their chaotic voices blending into a single deafening roar. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head as the sound tore through me. It wasn't just noise, it was a language, a message being forced into my mind, too vast and incomprehensible to understand. Images flashed behind my eyes, flames consuming a forest, shadows stretching across the earth, a void swallowing everything in its path. The others were on the ground, too, their faces pale and strained. Zoe was crying, her hands pressed against her ears, while Mason stared blankly at the figure, his lips moving silently as though he were trying to speak. Ryan was frozen, his gaze locked on the figure, his expression filled with a mix of terror and awe. The figure raised an arm, or what passed for an arm, and the void around it rippled, the air vibrating with its movement. The cracks beneath us spread outward, the green light flaring brighter, casting the entire space in an unearthly glow. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete it was deafening. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, it was a presence, a force that filled my mind and body, resonating through every cell. It wasn't words, but I understood it all the same. It wasn't words, but I understood it all the same. It wasn't a question, or a command. It was a choice. I realized then that the figure wasn't just watching us. It was waiting for me. The silence, after the whispers stopped, wasn't a relief. It was a suffocating, heavy thing that pressed against my ears and tightened around my chest. The figure loomed before us, a shape made of shadow and void, its edges constantly shifting, its presence undeniable. It didn't need a face or eyes or any feature at all for me to know it was watching. No, waiting. The air around us was impossibly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into my bones and made my breath catch in my throat. The ground beneath my knees pulsed faintly, like the slow, steady beat of a heart. The green light from the cracks in the surface cast everything in an eerie, otherworldly glow, making the shadows seem sharper, deeper, alive. It hadn't spoken yet, not in words, but its voice, that overwhelming, all-encompassing presence, was still inside me. It wasn't a thought or a feeling. It was a weight, pressing down on my mind, demanding acknowledgement. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I couldn't ignore it either. My hands were trembling, and I clenched them into fists, trying to steady myself. Around me, the others were still. Mason stared at the figure, his expression blank, his breathing shallow. Zoe was hunched over, her arms wrapped around herself, silent tears streaking her face. Ryan hadn't moved at all. He was frozen, his gaze locked on the void before us, his lips slightly parted as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It wasn't a step, or a glide, or anything I could define. It shifted, a ripple, in the fabric of this place, closing the distance between us in an instant. I gasped, scrambling backward on the trembling ground, my hands slipping against the smooth surface. The void seemed to expand around it, consuming the space, the air, the light. And then it spoke. The sound wasn't a voice. It wasn't something I heard with my ears. No, it was inside my head, vibrating through every corner of my mind, pushing out my own thoughts until there was only it. The words weren't words, not in any language I knew, but they burned with meaning, forcing themselves into my understanding. You have come far. The weight of the voice made me tremble, my vision blurring as I struggled to hold on to my sense of self. I tried to speak, to ask what it wanted, but my mouth wouldn't form the words. My throat felt tight, as though the air itself refused to let me speak. The figure shifted again, its edges rippling like water. The cracks beneath us deepened, their green glow pulsing in time with the voice. The pressure in the air grew heavier, the hum around us louder, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. You seek answers. Lul, supil, henendeta, ens, vars. The words weren't a question. They were a statement, a declaration, as though it already knew everything about us, about me. I could feel its presence pushing against my thoughts, probing, searching, unearthing memories I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't asking permission. Itadel. Ew. Olifu. It didn't need to. Mason was the first to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. What do you want from us? The figure didn't respond. Not immediately. It tilted, if such a thing could tilt, its form bending slightly toward him. The weight of its presence shifted, pressing down on Mason, making him drop to his knees. He let out a choked gasp, clutching his head as though he was trying to shield himself from it. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me. Stop, I shouted, though my voice sounded small, fragile in the vastness of the void. Leave him alone. The figure turned toward me. The moment its focus shifted, the pressure lifted from Mason, and he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The void seemed to narrow, pulling closer, wrapping itself around me. I felt its attention fully for the first time, and it was like being submerged in ice, every inch of me frozen, my thoughts grinding to a halt. You will decide. The words sent a jolt through me, sharp and electric. I stumbled backward, shaking my head. Decide what? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The cracks beneath us flared brighter, the green light turning almost blinding. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. The void shifted again, splitting open to reveal something in its center. A pedestal, dark and jagged, with a single object resting on top. It was the disc, the same one I had touched before, but it was different now. Its surface glowed faintly, the symbols etched into it pulsing with a rhythmic light. The energy radiating from it was overwhelming, pulling at me, drawing me closer even as every instinct screamed to stay away. One path to end, one path to become. The meaning of the words hit me like a physical blow. My knees buckled, and I barely caught myself before falling. The disc wasn't just a tool or an artifact. It was a choice, a decision that I had to make, one that would decide the fate of not just us, but everything. The weight of it crushed me, stealing the breath from my lungs. Zoe's voice broke through the suffocating silence. Ellie, don't, she cried, her voice raw with fear. You don't have to do this. I turned to look at her, tears streaming down her face, her hands outstretched toward me. Behind her, Mason was still on the ground, his eyes wide and unblinking, his lips moving silently. Ryan hadn't moved. He was still frozen, his gaze locked on the disc, his expression distant, almost empty. I wanted to tell her she was right, that I wouldn't touch it, that we'd find another way. But I couldn't, because I knew, deep down, there was no other way. The figure wasn't going to let us leave. The void wasn't going to let us leave. And not unless I chose. I stepped toward the pedestal, my legs trembling with every step. The disc pulsed brighter as I approached, the light growing stronger, the hum louder. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. The figure shifted one last time, its form bending, twisting, as though it were watching with anticipation. And then I made my choice. The instant my fingers wrapped around the disc, the air shattered like glass, an explosion of light and sound ripping through the void. The hum became a deafening roar, vibrating through my chest, my bones, my very thoughts. The weight of the figure's presence crashed into me like a tidal wave, forcing me to my knees. The disc pulsed violently in my hands, its glow so bright it burned against my skin, but I couldn't let go. It wouldn't let me. The ground beneath us cracked and shifted, the jagged lines of green light widening and splitting apart. The void itself began to ripple and twist, folding in on itself like a collapsing star. Mason screamed behind me, his voice lost in the chaos, and Zoe's frantic cries barely broke through the cacophony. Ryan didn't make a sound. The whispers returned, louder and sharper, a chaotic chorus that clawed at the edges of my mind. They weren't just noise, they were demands, each one pulling me in a different direction, each one louder than the last. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and the weight of the disc in my hands grew heavier, colder, like it was sinking into me. And then everything stopped. The roaring, the shaking, the light. It all vanished in an instant, leaving only silence and darkness. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, the disc still cold and solid in my hands. The void was still there, but it felt different now, smaller, quieter. The figure was gone. I turned, my legs weak beneath me, and saw Zoe and Mason huddled together a few feet away. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with terror, but they were alive. Ryan stood apart, his back to us, his shoulders rigid as he stared into the endless black. "It's not over," I said, my voice hoarse. The disc pulsed faintly in my hands, its light dim but steady. "It's just waiting." Zoe looked at me, her face streaked with tears. "Waiting for what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did you do, Ellie?" I couldn't answer. I didn't know. The figure's words echoed in my mind, the weight of their meaning pressing down on me. One path to end. One path to end. One path to become. I had chosen, but I didn't understand what that choice meant. Not yet. The ground beneath us trembled, a faint vibration that sent ripples through the air. The cracks in the surface began to glow again, their green light growing brighter, more intense. The void around us seemed to stretch and warp, the edges of the space twisting into impossible shapes. Ryan turned to face us, his expression unreadable. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his movements were slow and deliberate. He looked at the disc in my hands, then at me, and for a moment I thought I saw recognition, or maybe understanding, in his gaze. "You don't realize what you've done," he said, his voice low and even. "It wasn't a choice. It was a trade." "A trade?" Mason asked, his voice rising with panic. "What the hell does that mean?" Ryan didn't answer. He stepped closer, his movements unnervingly calm. "Bailvini, Ka. The hollow doesn't give. It takes. Always. And now is taking you." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The disc grew colder in my hands, its pulse quickening, matching the frantic rhythm of my heart. I stumbled back, shaking my head. "No," I whispered. That's not what I chose." Ryan tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "You didn't choose to stop it. You chose to hold it, to become it." The cracks in the ground widened, the green light spilling upward like smoke, wrapping around my legs, my arms, my chest. It wasn't painful. It was cold, a numbing chill that seeped into my skin and spread through my body. The whispers returned, softer this time, their tone almost gentle, like a lullaby meant to soothe. Zoe reached for me, her eyes wide with terror. "Ellie, don't let it take you. Fight it." I tried to hold on, to resist the pull, but the disc wouldn't let go. Its light flared brighter, the symbols etched into its surface, glowing with an intensity that burned against my skin. The whispers grew louder, drowning out Zoe's voice, Mason's shouts, even the sound of my own thoughts. The void around us began to collapse, the edges folding inward, the darkness consuming everything. The cracks in the ground erupted with light, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me toward the center of the room, toward the pedestal where the disc belonged. And then I understood. The hollow wasn't just a presence or a place. It was a cycle, an endless loop of destruction and rebirth, feeding on the choices of those who found themselves trapped within it. The disc was its heart, its anchor, and by taking it, I had bound myself to it. I wasn't just a part of the cycle now. I was the cycle. I looked at Zoe and Mason one last time, their faces blurred and distant, and I forced a smile through the tears streaming down my face. "Go," I said, my voice breaking. "Get out of here before it's too late." Zoe shook her head, her tears falling freely. "We can't leave you. You have to," I said, the light around me growing brighter, the pull stronger. "I'll hold it back. I'll keep it here. But you have to go. Please." Mason grabbed Zoe's arm, pulling her toward the narrowing corridor behind us. "She's right," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have to go." I watched them disappear into the darkness, their figures swallowed by the collapsing void. The disc pulsed one last time, and I felt the final piece of myself slip away. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence, and the light around me flared brighter than ever, consuming everything. And then there was nothing. The silence was absolute, a void that swallowed every sound, every thought, leaving only the faint rhythmic pulse of the disc in my hands. The cold that had seeped into my skin was gone, replaced by a strange, weightless sensation, as though I was suspended between two worlds. My vision swam, and when the darkness began to recede, I realized I wasn't standing anymore. The ground beneath me wasn't solid, not in the way I understood solidity. It shifted and pulsed like a living thing, dark and reflective, stretching out into an endless horizon. The faint green light from before was gone, replaced by a dim bluish glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. I was alone. Zoe, Mason, Ryan. There was no sign of them. My breath hitched, and I turned in place, searching the endless expanse for something, anything. But there was nothing. Just me and the disk. Its glow dim now, its once sharp pulse erratic and weak. Then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing, but they grew louder, layering over one another until they were a cacophony of voices. Unlike before, there was no malice in them. They weren't commands or demands, but they were questions, a relentless interrogation that wormed its way into my thoughts. Why did you choose? What did you hope to gain? Who are you to decide? The questions came faster, overlapping until they were a singular, deafening roar. I clutched my head, squeezing my eyes shut. But the voices didn't stop. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside me, in my mind, pulling at the edges of my consciousness like threads unraveling a tightly woven tapestry. The ground beneath me rippled, and I opened my eyes to see the void shifting. Shapes emerged from the darkness, rising and twisting into vague, humanoid forms. They surrounded me, their movements slow and deliberate, their outlines blurred as though they were made of smoke and shadow. None of them had faces, but I could feel their gaze, sharp and piercing, cutting through every layer of my being. One of them stepped forward, its form solidified slightly, the smoke coalescing into something more tangible. The whispers quieted, and for a moment, there was only its presence, heavy and suffocating. You chose, it said, its voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the air. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, flat and emotionless, as though the act of choosing had been inevitable. I didn't know what I was choosing, I said, my voice trembling. I had to stop it. The figure tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. You stopped nothing, it said. You exchanged one cycle for another. The words hit me like a physical blow, the weight of them settling in my chest. What does that mean? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. What happens now? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm, if it could be called that, a limb of shadow and smoke that extended toward me. The disk in my hands grew heavier, its glow intensifying, and I felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing me toward the figure. My feet moved without my consent, each step closer dragging me deeper into its orbit. The other figures moved as one, circling around me, their forms shifting and merging like waves crashing against each other. The whispers returned, low and rhythmic, chanting something I couldn't understand, but felt in my bones. The disc pulsed in time with the chant, its light flickering like a dying flame. "You are the vessel now," the figure said, its voice cutting through the whispers. "The anchor, Bay." "No," I said, shaking my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "That's not what I wanted. That's not what I chose." The figure tilted its head again, as if amused by my protest. "The hollow does not care what you want," it said. "It only cares that you chose." Ah. The ground beneath me trembled, the smooth surface splintering into jagged shards that floated upward, suspended in the shifting void. The figures moved closer, their forms pressing against me, their whispers filling every corner of my mind. The disc burned in my hands, its light blinding now, its pulse erratic and frantic. I screamed, the sound ripped from my throat by the weight of their presence. But it didn't stop them. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, the figures merging into a single towering shape that blotted out everything else. The void collapsed inward, the darkness folding in on itself until there was nothing left but the disc, its glow the only light in the endless expanse. And then, just as suddenly, it was quiet. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, and found myself back in the clearing. The house was gone. The forest was gone. The others were gone. I stood alone in the center of an empty field, the disc still clutched in my hands. Its surface was cold now, its light extinguished, but I could still feel it pulsing faintly, like a heartbeat beneath my fingers. The sky above me was a swirling mass of gray and black, the horizon stretching out endlessly in every direction. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of ash and something metallic. I looked down at the disc, its surface dull and lifeless, and felt a chill run through me. The whispers were gone, but their presence lingered, a faint hum at the edge of my thoughts. I knew, with a sinking certainty, that the choice I had made wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The hum lingered in the back of my mind, low and persistent, a soundless vibration that I couldn't shake. I stood alone in the vast emptiness of the clearing, the disc cold and lifeless in my hands, its weight pressing down on me like a chain I couldn't break. The horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, the swirling mass of gray clouds above spinning slowly, like a storm that had forgotten how to rage. I took a shaky breath, the air heavy and metallic, stinging the back of my throat. My legs felt weak beneath me, as though the act of standing was more than my body could handle. The silence around me was suffocating, broken only by the faint pulse of the disc, its rhythm matching the unsteady beat of my heart. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, staring at the barren expanse. Time didn't seem to exist here. Minutes, hours, they were meaningless. All that existed was the weight of the disc in my hands and the oppressive presence that loomed just beyond the edge of perception. Then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps. My breath hitched, my body tensing as I turned toward the sound. It was distant at first, barely audible over the hum. But it grew louder, closer, each step deliberate and measured. The gray clouds above twisted faster, the swirling sky darkening as the footsteps echoed through the clearing. Ellie. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but it carried an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, my hands tightening around the disc as I searched for the source of the sound. At first, there was nothing, just the empty field, stretching out endlessly. But then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was human, or at least it looked human. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and its form was hazy, like it was caught between this world and somewhere else. As it drew closer, I recognized it. The face was blurred, the edges indistinct, but there was no mistaking who it was. Ryan G. I stumbled back, my heart racing as he stepped closer, his gaze locked on me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "You didn't make it. I made it," he said, his voice calm, too calm, but not the way you think. His eyes, if they were still eyes, locked on mine, and I felt the weight of his stare pierce through me. They weren't Ryan's eyes anymore. They were dark, bottomless voids, empty and endless, pulling at me with a force I couldn't resist. "You took it," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "You thought you could hold it, control it. But you can't, Ellie. It's not yours." I took a step back, the disc clutched tightly against my chest. "I didn't have a choice," I said, my voice trembling. "I was trying to stop it." He tilted his head, a slow, unnatural movement that made my skin crawl. "You didn't stop anything. You only became part of it." The words hit me like a blow, the weight of their meaning sinking into my chest. "No," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "That's not. I didn't want this." The hum in the air grew louder, sharper, vibrating through the ground beneath me. The disc in my hands pulsed harder, its once dim glow flaring to life, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. Ryan, or whatever he had become, took another step closer, his form rippling and twisting like smoke caught in a storm. "You think you can control it?" he asked, his voice cutting through the hum like a blade. "You think you can hold it back? You can't. It's bigger than you, bigger than all of us." I stumbled again, my knees threatening to give out as the disc grew heavier, its glow almost blinding. The air around me felt alive, charged with an energy that pressed against my skin, my chest, my thoughts. "I have to try?" I said, forcing the words out. "I can't let it. You already have." He interrupted, his voice rising. "It's inside you, Ellie. It's always been inside you. And now, it's awake." The ground beneath us cracked, jagged lines of green light spidering out from where I stood. The hum grew deafening, the disc shaking violently in my hands. No. The weight of it pulled me down, dragging me to my knees as the cracks spread, the light consuming the clearing. Ryan stepped closer, his form dissolving and reforming with each step, his voice echoing in my mind. You're not its vessel. You're its anchor, and anchors don't move. They stay. The words cut through me, sharp and final, and I realized with a sickening certainty what he meant. I wasn't meant to hold the hollow back. I was meant to hold it here, to keep it contained, no matter the cost. The cracks beneath me widened, the green light flaring brighter as the ground split open. The void that lay beneath was endless, dark, and hungry, and it pulled at me with a force I couldn't fight. The disc burned in my hands, its glow searing into my skin, but I couldn't let go. I was bound to it now, as much a part of it as it was of me. Ryan, if it was still Ryan, stopped a few feet away, his gaze fixed on me. This is your choice, he said, to stay or to let it consume everything. The void below roared, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams, and I felt the pull intensify, dragging me closer to the edge. My hands trembled, the disc slipping in my grasp, and I knew I didn't have much time. I looked at Ryan one last time, his face unreadable, and then I let go. The disc fell, its light flaring one final time before it disappeared into the void. The cracks widened, the ground collapsing beneath me, and I felt myself falling, the weight of the hollow pulling me down into its endless depths. The last thing I saw was Ryan, standing at the edge of the void, his form dissolving into the swirling darkness. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the infinite consuming silence of the hollow. But the forest loomed over us like a cathedral of ancient shadows, the air thick and silent, holding its breath as we crossed the threshold into its depths. My boots crunched softly against the uneven path, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive stillness. I gripped my camera tightly, the strap cutting into my palm, the weight of what we were about to uncover pressing down on me harder than the loaded equipment. We had arrived at Blackwood Pines just as the last light of day bled away behind the jagged treetops. The forest had been waiting for us. I felt it the moment we stepped off the gravel road and onto the dirt trail that wound through the towering pines. The air changed, grew heavier, colder, like stepping into a place untouched by time or by anything living. A faint, acrid smell lingered, faintly metallic, like rusting iron. Fright was ahead of me, his flashlight cutting narrow beams through the dense underbrush. Every so often he'd glance at the map, his movements quick and precise, his expression unreadable. Behind me, Isla hesitated, her breath visible in the unnatural chill, her steps cautious. Dana brought up the rear, silent and tense, his hand resting on the knife clipped to his belt. He hadn't said much since we arrived, but the way his eyes darted between the trees told me he felt it too, the watchfulness of the forest. The trail narrowed, forcing us to walk single file. The deeper we went, the darker it grew, the canopy above thick and interwoven, shutting out even the pale glow of the rising moon. My flashlight flickered, the weak light barely illuminating the trail ahead, as though the shadows were thicker here, heavier. I tightened my grip on it, swallowing the unease that clawed at the edges of my mind. "Stop," Reed said abruptly, his voice low and firm. "Fulvis." He crouched, holding his flashlight over something on the ground. I stepped closer, the beam of my own light catching the edge of what he'd found, a carving etched into the dirt. It was faint, but deliberate, the lines forming a crude spiral with jagged symbols radiating outward. I knelt beside him, my pulse quickening. "What is that?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I felt the need to lower my voice. Right didn't answer. Hence, his eyes scanned the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. He pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket, flipping through pages filled with sketches and notes. The light from his flashlight flickered as he moved, casting shifting shadows across the strange carving. Isla stood a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her breath shallow. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were wide, fixed on something just beyond the edge of the flashlight beams. I followed her gaze, but saw nothing. Just trees, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal hands. Danny shifted behind us, his boots scuffing against the dirt. "We shouldn't linger," he muttered, his voice tense. "This place, it doesn't feel right." I wanted to argue, to remind him why we were here, but the words caught in my throat. He was right. The forest felt wrong, not just unsettling, but actively malevolent, like it was pushing against us, trying to force us out. Wright stood, slipping his notebook back into his pocket. "We're close," he said, his voice steady but low. "The map says Camp Ashwood is just ahead." We pressed on, the tension between us thick and unspoken. The trail began to widen, the trees thinning slightly, though the darkness didn't lessen. The air grew colder, the acrid smell stronger, stinging the back of my throat. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of broken branches and torn underbrush, as though something large had moved through here recently. When we reached the clearing, the sight of the camp hit me like a punch to the chest. Elle saw. The cabins were barely standing, their roofs caved in, their walls covered in moss and rot. The main lodge was the only structure still intact, its windows shattered, the door hanging open, creaking softly in the breeze. The clearing itself was overgrown, weeds and tall grass reclaiming the space. But beneath the decay, I could see the faint outlines of stone paths leading between the buildings. I raised my camera, the lens capturing the eerie desolation of the scene. The faint hum of the equipment was the only sound, a fragile thread of normalcy in a place that felt anything but normal. My hand shook as I adjusted the focus, the image sharp but unsteady, the edges of the frame seeming to blur as though the forest itself resisted being recorded. Isla moved toward the main lodge, her footsteps hesitant, her eyes darting between the cabins. "There's something here," she murmured, more to herself than to any of us. "Duo." Her voice was distant, almost hollow, and it sent a chill down my spine. Danny followed her, his flashlight sweeping across the lodge's broken windows. "Be careful," he said, his voice tight. "We don't know what's inside." I hesitated, the weight of the camera in my hands suddenly feeling like an anchor. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place behind. But I couldn't. The pull of the forest, the need to know, was too strong. I took a step forward, then another. The crunch of my boots against the dry grass impossibly loud. Inside the lodge, the air was damp and suffocating, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The floorboards groaned under our weight, and I had to duck beneath a low-hanging beam to avoid splinters. The walls were covered in graffiti, the words faded and indecipherable, but beneath them I could see the faint outlines of symbols, spirals and jagged lines etched into the wood. In the center of the room was a table, its surface warped and blackened, as though it had been burned. Resting on it was a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle with age. Ride moved toward it, his movements careful, almost reverent. He opened the journal, flipping through the pages, his flashlight illuminating the faded handwriting. "The watchers in the trees," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're always watching, always waiting." A sudden, sharp creak echoed through the lodge, and we all froze. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound reverberating in the silence. I turned toward the door, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows, but there was nothing there, just the emptiness of the forest beyond. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and distant, like a voice carried on the wind. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't human. The forest was awake, and it knew we were here. The whispers didn't stop. They coiled through the lodge like smoke, low and indecipherable, but undeniably there. Each sound scraped against my nerves, sharp and invasive, yet no one else seemed to acknowledge them. Isla was the first to break the heavy silence, her voice trembling as she stepped closer to the journal Ride held. "We shouldn't touch that," she whispered, her gaze darting toward the walls, the shadows seeming to shift in the dim light. "It's not safe." Ride ignored her, his fingers tracing the faded writing on the brittle pages. "And this was written by someone from the camp," he said, his tone unnervingly calm. "They knew something about the Watchers." He flipped to another page, his flashlight beam illuminating a hastily scrawled drawing of a tree surrounded by jagged shape. Beneath it, the words, "The hollow nose," were scratched into the paper over and over again, as if the author had been desperate to make the message clear. Danae's flashlight swept across the room, the beam catching on something in the corner, a trapdoor, its edges lined with rusted metal. "There's a basement," he said, his voice tight. Why would a summer camp need a basement? I followed his gaze, my stomach knotting at the sight. The whispers seemed to intensify, the sound almost eager. The rational part of me screamed to leave it alone, to turn around and walk out of the lodge, but the pull of the place was too strong. I had to know what was down there. Without waiting for the others, I stepped toward the trapdoor. My boots creaked against the warped floorboards as I knelt, brushing away a thick layer of dust to reveal more of the rusted edges. The metal was cold under my fingers, and the air around it seemed heavier, colder. I glanced back at the others, my heart pounding. "Help me open it," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dan hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Stepping forward. Together, we gripped the edges of the trapdoor, the metal biting into our hands as we heaved it open. The hinges groaned loudly, the sound echoing through the lodge, and a rush of cold air billowed up from below, carrying with it the faint, acrid scent of decay. The flashlight beams barely penetrated the darkness below, revealing only a narrow wooden staircase descending into the void. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever was down there had been waiting for us. "I don't like this," Isla muttered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She was trembling, her eyes wide and darting toward the open trapdoor. "There's something down there. I can feel it." Fright was already moving, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. He descended the steps slowly, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "There's writing on the walls," he called up, his voice echoing faintly. "More symbols. And something else." I followed him, my heart hammering in my chest with each step. The wooden stairs creaked ominously under my weight, and the air grew colder the deeper I went. At the bottom, the space opened into a small, cramped room with stone walls. The light from my flashlight illuminated more carvings, dozens of them, etched into the stone in jagged, uneven lines. They pulsed faintly, as though reacting to our presence. Fright was standing in the center of the room, his flashlight trained on an altar made of blackened stone. Its surface was covered in ash and dark stains, the edges worn smooth as though it had been used many times. Above it, etched into the wall, was the same tree and spiral symbol from the journal, but larger, more detailed. The spirals extended outward, merging with the other carvings on the walls, forming a chaotic, tangled pattern that made my head ache just looking at it. Dane's voice cut through the silence, low and tense. "This is a place of sacrifice." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I felt the weight of them settle in my chest. the implications sinking in like a stone. The whispers around us shifted, their tone darker now, less eager and more demanding. Ellie's footsteps were hesitant as she joined us, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the altar, and I saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, or maybe understanding. This was theirs, she said softly, her voice trembling. The counselors. This is where it started. I turned to her, my pulse quickening. What do you mean? How do you know that? She shook her head, her hands clutching the edge of her jacket. I don't know. I see them. Flashes, like memories that aren't mine. They were afraid. Ride stepped closer to the altar, his flashlight revealing more of the dark stains on its surface. The hollow nose, he murmured, repeating the phrase from the journal. This ritual, it wasn't to summon something. It was to contain it. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with a tangible pressure that made it hard to breathe. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their light casting eerie, shifting shadows across the room. I felt a presence behind me, and when I turned, I saw nothing, but I knew something was there. Dane's hand was on his knife, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. We need to leave, he said, his voice low and urgent. No, before any of us could respond, the door above us slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into near total darkness. My flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as the whispers rose to a fever pitch, their chaotic tones reverberating through the room. The carvings on the walls began to shift, their lines twisting and writhing as though they were alive. The altar pulsed with a faint red light, and the shadows around us deepened, stretching toward the center of the room. Isla let out a choked gasp, her hands clutching her head as she sank to her knees. It's here, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising hum. It's watching us. The ground beneath us trembled, a low vibration that sent dust raining down from the ceiling. My heart raced as I backed toward the staircase, my mind screaming for me to run. But my feet felt rooted to the spot. The air was thick with fear, heavy and suffocating, and I could feel the weight of the presence pressing down on me, invading every corner of my mind. And then, from the shadows, it moved. The shadows shifted, stretching and twisting along the walls, as if the very darkness itself had come alive. My breath caught in my throat, frozen as the air in the basement grew heavier, colder, suffocating. I couldn't see it, not fully, but I felt it, a presence thick and oppressive, pressing against my skin, my thoughts, my very being. My flashlight flickered, its beam sputtering weakly, barely cutting through the encroaching black. It's here, Isla whispered again, her voice trembling and distant. She was crouched near the altar, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes unfocused as though staring at something only she could see. It's always been here. A low vibration pulsed through the floor, the stone beneath my feet shuddering like something massive was stirring below us. The carvings on the walls pulsed in unison, their faint red glow casting distorted shadows across the room. Envelop and the whispers returned, louder and sharper this time, like 100 overlapping voices, speaking a language I couldn't understand, but felt in the deepest corners of my mind. Dane pulled his knife, the metallic sound of the blade leaving its sheath sharp and jarring against the cacophony around us. "Right, we're leaving," he said, his voice firm but strained. "No." Before anyone could move, the shadows surged forward. They didn't move like normal shadows. They writhed and flowed like liquid, their edges rippling and breaking apart before reforming. They weren't shapeless either. Within their chaotic movements, I could see hints of form, elongated limbs, hollow eyes, mouths that opened and closed, soundlessly. They poured across the floor and walls, converging toward the altar, toward Isla. She let out a choked cry, her hands clawing at her temples. "It's in my head," she gasped. "It's in all of us." "It's Harl." Fright grabbed her arm, trying to pull her away from the altar. But the shadows reacted instantly. They lashed out, tendrils of darkness snapping toward him like whips, forcing him to stumble back. The tendrils didn't just move. They grew, stretching impossibly long, wrapping around the altar, like they were reclaiming something that had been taken from them. "Harper, move!" Dan shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the staircase. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor, its beam casting jagged, erratic light across the chaos. The shadows were everywhere now, filling the room with a suffocating, writhing presence. They didn't need form to be terrifying. They simply were, an overwhelming force that left no room for anything else. Isla screamed, her voice raw and piercing, as one of the tendrils wrapped around her ankle, dragging her toward the altar. Ride lunged, grabbing her other arm and pulling with all his strength. But the shadows were stronger. They coiled around her legs, her waist, her chest, lifting her off the ground as she thrashed and fought. I could only watch, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. He would be wounded. The altar pulsed brighter, the carvings on its surface glowing with an intensity that burned against my eyes. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their words slicing through my mind, too loud to block out, too alien to comprehend. Then Isla stopped, screaming. Her body went still, her head tilting back as her eyes rolled into her skull. The tendrils of shadow tightened around her, pulling her closer to the altar. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the whispers, but her expression was blank, empty, like she wasn't really there anymore. Ride stumbled back, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "We have to break the connection," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. It's using her. It's trying to complete the ritual." The words jolted me into action. My eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could help. My gaze landed on the journal still clutched in Reed's hand. its pages flapping wildly in the unnatural wind that had filled the room. "The journal!" I yelled, reaching for it. "What does it say about stopping this?" Ride flipped through the pages frantically, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely hold on to them. It talks about a symbol," he stammered, "a binding sigil. But it doesn't say how to." His words were cut off as one of the tendrils lashed toward him, knocking the journal from his hands and sending it skidding across the floor. The shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though feeding off our fear. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently, their glow erratic and disjointed, casting the room in flashes of crimson light. Dane didn't hesitate. He charged toward Isla, his knife slashing through the tendrils of shadow that bound her. The blade didn't cut them. Not exactly. But it disrupted their form, causing them to recoil and writhe. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the altar with a strength born of sheer desperation. But the shadows didn't let go. They surged forward, enveloping the altar, Isla, Dane, everything. The glow from the carvings intensified, and for a brief moment I saw it. A figure rising from the darkness, impossibly tall and skeletal, its limbs too long, its face a hollow void. It wasn't fully formed, its body flickering in and out of existence, like a reflection in broken glass. But its presence was undeniable. The whispers stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. The figure turned toward me, its hollow face tilting as though it was studying me, measuring me. The shadows around it stilled, coiling tightly around the altar, as the figure extended one impossibly long arm in my direction. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The weight of its gaze, or whatever passed for a gaze, pressed down on me, freezing me in place. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, the air growing thicker, heavier. And then it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed directly in my mind, low and resonant, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "Choose me." The word rippled through me, sharp and inescapable. The disc, Dine, the journal, .dv, dial, the altar. My mind scrambled for answers, for something to fight back, but the truth was clear. This wasn't about survival. It was about submission. Envelop, the word reverberated through my mind. Choose. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum, as unavoidable as the crushing weight of the presence bearing down on me. The shadows around the room coiled tighter, pressing against the walls and floor, alive with tension, like they were waiting for something. I couldn't think. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out every other sound. My flashlight had long since sputtered out, leaving only the crimson glow of the carvings on the walls to cast fractured light across the scene. Isla lay limp in Dane's arms, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, her face pale and glistening with sweat. Fright stood frozen near the journal, his eyes wide, unblinking, locked on the skeletal figure that loomed above the altar. The figure didn't move, but its presence pulsed, rippling outward like a wave of icy water. The tendrils of shadow wrapped around the altar tightened, their movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring the moment. Its voice came again, not a sound, but a pressure, forcing its way into my thoughts, carving through my defenses like a blade. Choose, sacrifice, or consume. The meaning hit me like a blow, the weight of it pressing the air from my lungs. I stumbled backward, my hands grasping for the wall, for anything solid to ground myself. It wanted a sacrifice. One of us. It didn't matter who. The choice was ours, but the cost was non-negotiable. No, I gasped, shaking my head. My voice sounded small, lost in the vastness of the space. We're not. We can't. The figure tilted its head, its hollow face, somehow conveying a chilling sense of amusement. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, their red light casting jagged shadows that stretched and twisted across the room. The whispers returned, louder now, blending into a cacophony of voices that filled every corner of the basement. Danae's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and strained. Harper, we don't have a choice. He was holding Isla tightly, his knife still clutched in his other hand, its blade slick with whatever substance the shadows had left behind. His eyes met mine, pleading, if we don't do something, it's going to take all of us. Fright was shaking, his hands trembling as he crouched to pick up the journal. He flipped through the pages frantically, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the walls. The ritual, he muttered, his voice barely audible over the whispers. It needs blood, a sacrifice to seal it, to keep it contained. Ella stirred, her eyes fluttering, open. Her gaze was unfocused, glassy, but her lips moved, forming words that I could barely hear. It's too late, she whispered. It's already here. The shadows around the altar surged, writhing and twisting, forming shapes that were almost human but too distorted, too wrong. They moved toward us, slow and deliberate, their jagged forms flickering like firelight. My body screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in the grip of the thing's impossible gaze. One, Fright dropped the journal, his voice rising in panic. We have to decide, now. The shadows closed in, their forms blending into one another, their movements fluid and predatory. The figure remained still, its towering form watching, waiting, the weight of its presence growing heavier with every passing second. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood, the acrid smell of decay, the suffocating pressure of inevitability. Dane took a step forward, his jaw clenched, his grip on the knife tightening. If it has to be someone, he started, his voice breaking. "No, no," I shouted, the word tearing from my throat before I could stop it. My body moved on instinct, stepping between him and the altar, the shadows rippling at the sudden motion. "We'll find another way. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Reed said, his voice hollow. His face was pale, his hands clutching the edge of the altar for support. This thing is ancient. It's not asking. It's demanding. And if we don't give it what it wants, it'll take everything." The figure shifted, its skeletal form stretching, its shadow spreading outward like an oil slick. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. The air vibrated with energy, a force so overwhelming it felt like the room itself was about to collapse. Isla's voice cut through the noise, soft but clear. "I'll do it." The words hit me like a physical blow, my breath catching in my throat as I turned to her. She was on her feet now, unsteady but determined, her eyes clearer than they had been moments ago. There was a strange calmness in her expression, a resignation that sent a chill through me. "No," I said, stepping toward her, my hands outstretched. "You don't have to do this. We'll figure something out. We can." She shook her head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "It's already chosen me," she said quietly. "I can feel it. It's been in my head since we got here. This is the only way." The shadows recoiled slightly, their movements slowing, as though they were waiting for her to step forward. The figure tilted its head again, its hollow face fixed on Isla, its presence thrumming with approval. Dana reached for her, his voice cracking. "Isla, no." She held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "It's okay," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "It has to be me." She turned toward the altar, her steps slow but deliberate, the shadows parting as she approached. The figure loomed above her, its form flickering, its skeletal limbs reaching outward like branches. The carvings on the walls pulsed in time with her movements, the whispers shifting to a rhythmic chant, low and reverent. I wanted to stop her. I wanted to scream, to pull her back, to do anything but stand there and watch. But my body wouldn't move. The weight of the moment, the presence of the thing in the room, held me in place, powerless. Isla climbed onto the altar, her head held high, her hands trembling at her sides. The figure bent toward her, its form enveloping her completely, the shadows closing in around them both. The carvings flared one last time, their light blinding, and then everything went dark. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whispers returned, softer now, fading into the background like the final notes of a song. The air grew still, the oppressive weight lifting, and the shadows receded, melting back into the walls. The figure was gone. So was Isla. Fright. The silence after Isla vanished was unbearable, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. The oppressive hum that had filled the basement was gone, replaced by an eerie, hollow stillness. that felt somehow worse. The carvings on the walls no longer glowed, their jagged shapes now lifeless, dull. Even the shadows had receded, curling back into the edges of the room, as though sated by what had just transpired. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my arms hanging limply at my sides. The space where Isla had stood, where she had given herself over to the thing, was empty now. Nothing left behind except the faint, acrid scent of burning stone. The altar, dark and cracked, looked lifeless, ordinary, but I knew it wasn't. I could feel the faint pulse of energy radiating from it. A quiet reminder of what it had taken. Dane was the first to speak. His voice hoarse and raw. "She's gone." He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact, one that carried the weight of defeat and disbelief. Ride sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his face pale and drawn. "It worked," he muttered, his words barely audible. It stopped. I wanted to scream at him, to grab him by the shoulders and demand to know how he could sound so calm, so detached, after what we'd just witnessed. But I couldn't summon the strength. My chest was tight, my throat dry, my mind a storm of chaos and denial. Isla was gone, and we had let it happen. No, we had made it happen. The ground beneath us felt wrong, unstable, as if the very foundation of this place had been shaken loose. I glanced at the walls, at the lifeless carvings, and felt a flicker of unease. The oppressive presence was gone. Yes, but it didn't feel like we'd won. The room wasn't empty. It was waiting. "We have to leave," I said, my voice trembling. The words felt distant, as though someone else were speaking them. "We need to get out of here." Dan didn't argue. He stood slowly, his movements heavy and deliberate, his knife still clutched tightly in his hand. His gaze lingered on the altar for a moment before he turned away, his jaw tight, his expression unreadable. Wright hesitated, his eyes darting toward the journal lying on the floor. "Whatever." "Leave it," I snapped, surprising even myself with the sharpness of my tone. "It's not worth it." He nodded reluctantly, his shoulders slumping as he pushed himself to his feet. Together, we climbed the creaking stairs, each step feeling like it might give way beneath us. The air in the lodge above was colder than before, the darkness heavier, more stifling. My flashlight flickered weakly as I swung it toward the shattered windows, half expecting to see the shadows from below crawling across the walls. But the lodge was silent, still, empty. Dan was already moving, heading for the door without waiting for the rest of us. I followed, my breath quick and shallow, my legs shaking beneath me. Wright lingered for a moment, his gaze fixed on the trapdoor we had just climbed through, before he turned and followed. Outside, the air was sharp and biting, the sky above churning with heavy gray clouds. The forest around us seemed darker than before, the trees looming like silent sentinels, their twisted branches forming jagged silhouettes against the faint light of the moon. The whispers were gone, but the quiet was oppressive. unnatural, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. "We need to get back to the trail," Dane said, his voice clipped and tense. "If we stay here any longer." A sudden low rumble cut him off, the ground beneath us trembling faintly. It wasn't like the vibrations from before, in the basement. This was deeper, more distant, but unmistakable. Something wasn't right. Ride froze, his eyes widening. "Did you feel that?" The rumble came again, stronger this time, the trees around us shaking as though caught in a violent wind. I stumbled, grabbing onto a nearby branch to steady myself, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across the clearing. Then I heard it, a faint, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It wasn't like the whispers or the hum. This was different, deeper, hungrier, Toli. The altar. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The thing we'd tried to stop. It wasn't gone. It was still here, still tethered to this place. And it was waking up. "We have to move," I shouted, my voice rising in panic. No. We broke into a run, our footsteps crunching against the frozen ground, our breath clouding the air in frantic bursts. The forest seemed to close in around us, the path twisting and narrowing, the trees crowding closer together, as though trying to trap us. My flashlight flickered again, its weak beam barely illuminating the trail ahead. Behind us, the sound grew louder, a deep, resonant vibration that reverberated through the ground and into my chest. The whispers had returned, faint and fragmented, overlapping and chaotic, their voices blending into a single unrelenting tone that filled my mind with a crushing sense of dread. Ride stumbled, his flashlight slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. Dan grabbed his arm, pulling him upright, his own face pale and strained. "Keep moving," he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The rumbling intensified, the ground beneath us splitting in jagged lines, faint green light seeping through the cracks. The forest around us seemed to warp and shift, the trees twisting unnaturally, their branches stretching toward us like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, sharper, the metallic tang of blood and decay filling my lungs. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to keep running, to focus on the faint glimmers of light filtering through the trees ahead. But the sound was inescapable, pressing against my ears, my chest, my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The ground beneath us stilled, the forest around us frozen in place. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my flashlight dangling limply from my hand. Dan and Reed were beside me, both pale and wide-eyed, their expressions a mirror of my own. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet, and in that silence, I realized something terrible. The thing we had tried to contain hadn't been stopped. It had been set free. The silence pressed down on us like a physical weight, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. The flashlight in my hand flickered weakly, its beam barely illuminating the warped and twisted trees that surrounded us. I couldn't tell if the faint hum I heard was real or just in my head, a lingering echo of the thing we'd tried and failed to stop. Wright's voice came first, breaking the quiet. "It's not gone." His words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried the weight of certainty. He looked over at me, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "You felt it too, didn't you?" I nodded, unable to speak. There was no denying it. The oppressive presence hadn't left. If anything, it had grown stronger, more pervasive, like it was stretching itself through the forest, testing the limits of its newfound freedom. Dan stood a few feet ahead, his back to us, his shoulders rigid. He gripped his knife so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. "It's moving," he said, his voice low but steady. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact, one that settled heavily in the pit of my stomach. The ground beneath us felt wrong, too still, too quiet. The trees around us seemed to lean closer, their branches tangled like jagged claws reaching for us. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, sharp and metallic, as though the forest itself was rotting from the inside out. "We have to keep moving," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "If we stay here." A sound cut me off, low and guttural, reverberating through the stillness. It wasn't like the whispers or the hum we'd heard before. This was deeper, more primal, a sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "View." It came from somewhere far behind us, but the direction didn't matter. It was everywhere, all at once. Dane turned to face us, his eyes dark and sharp. "We're not outpacing it," he said. "It's not something you can outrun." "Then, what do we do?" Wright snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "Do you have a plan, Dane? Because I'd love to hear it." Before Dane could respond, the ground beneath us trembled, a faint vibration that rippled outward, shaking the twisted trees and sending a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. The air seemed to grow colder, sharper, each breath burning in my chest like ice. Then the whispers returned. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder with every passing second. They weren't the chaotic, overlapping voices from before. This time, they were deliberate, focused, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "You let it out." The words came from everywhere and nowhere, spoken in a voice that wasn't a voice, but a feeling pressed into my mind. I staggered back, clutching my head as the weight of the presence bore down on me. Wright let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling as he sank to the ground. "It's in my head," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's inside all of us." Dane grabbed my arm, his grip grounding me. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We have to move, now." I forced myself to stand, my legs shaking beneath me, and followed him as he led the way through the forest. The whispers didn't fade. They followed us, growing louder, more insistent, their words sharp and accusatory. "You cannot contain what was never meant to be contained. You are the key. The hollow demands its anchor." The last phrase sent a jolt of panic through me, my chest tightening as the meaning settled in. I didn't know what it meant to be an anchor, but I knew enough to realize it wasn't a role I wanted. "Etsu, bis condis," the thing we'd encountered, the thing we'd unleashed. It wasn't done with us. It wasn't done with me. Well, it wasn't done with me. Ahead, the forest began to change. Up, the trees grew denser, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out what little light remained. The path beneath our feet twisted and narrowed, the dirt giving way to uneven, jagged rocks. The air grew colder still, each breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Ride stumbled behind me, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. "Wait," he said, his voice weak. "I can't." "We can't stop," Dane said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If we stop, it catches us." I turned to help Reed, my hands gripping his arms as I pulled him upright. His face was pale, his breathing labored, but he nodded, forcing himself to keep moving. The whispers were deafening now, their words blending into a single, unrelenting chant that drilled into my mind. The ground beneath us trembled again, this time stronger, more violent. The rocks shifted underfoot, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before I fell. The trees around us seemed to pulse, their gnarled branches swaying in unison, as though moved by an invisible force. Then I saw it, up ahead, through the tangled mess of branches. A clearing. "Dan!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "There's an opening." We pushed forward, our movements frantic, the whispers and vibrations growing stronger with every step. The clearing was close now, the twisted trees giving way to an open expanse, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. It wasn't moonlight. It was something else, something cold and sterile, casting long, jagged shadows across the uneven ground. As we stumbled into the clearing, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the noise had been. The air was still, heavy with a tension that made my skin crawl. In the center of the clearing stood a structure, a massive, blackened obelisk, its surface etched with the same jagged carvings we'd seen in the lodge and the basement. The carvings pulsed faintly, their glow rhythmic and deliberate, like the beat of a heart. The ground around the obelisk was cracked and broken, faint tendrils of green light seeping through the gaps. The obelisk wasn't just a marker. "Elbi, Combol, P, Evers, and it was a focal point, a nexus of the thing We'd unleashed, and it was waiting for me. The realization hit me with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. The whispers had been right. I was the key. I was the anchor. I was the anchor. And now I had to face what that meant. The obelisk loomed over us, its surface alive, with a faint pulsating light that seemed to draw the air from my lungs. It wasn't just a structure. It was a presence, something ancient and wrong, something that had no place in the world we knew. The carvings etched into its surface writhed, shifting and rearranging themselves like they were alive, responding to our arrival. The ground beneath it was fractured, jagged lines of green light spilling out from the cracks, spreading across the clearing like veins. The faint hum that had haunted us in the forest was louder now, deep and resonant, vibrating through my chest. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, a pressure that pressed down on me, on all of us. I stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, the weight of the obelisk's presence pulling at me, filling my mind with a suffocating sense of inevitability. Behind me, Ride was gasping for breath, his hands clutching his knees as he struggled to stay upright. Dan stood silent and still, his knife dangling limply from his hand, his gaze fixed on the obelisk. The whispers returned, soft at first, threading through the clearing like a low wind. They grew louder with each passing second, their voices overlapping, indistinct yet purposeful, filling the air with a weight I couldn't ignore. And then, as one, they spoke a single word. Encore. The word hit me like a blow, sharp and undeniable, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. I didn't need them to explain. I could feel it. The obelisk wasn't just a marker or a remnant of some ancient ritual. It was a gate, a tether, and it was searching for someone to bind to it. That someone was me. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. No, this isn't right. The whispers didn't care. They surged louder, the force of them pressing into my thoughts, driving out everything else. The obelisk pulsed in time with them, its green light flaring brighter, casting jagged shadows across the clearing. The cracks in the ground widened, their edges glowing, the air growing colder, sharper. Dane stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Harper," he said, his tone firm but trembling. "We don't have another option. You've felt it, haven't you? It's been pulling at you since we got here." I shook my head, stumbling back another step. No, I can't. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Reed said, his voice weak but resolute. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes hollow and resigned. "The journal. It was clear. The hollow needs an anchor. Without one, it won't stop. It'll keep spreading." The clearing seemed to pulse with energy, the air vibrating with a rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The obelisk flared again, brighter this time, and the green light spilled outward, reaching for us like grasping hands. The whispers turned sharp, insistent, their words blending into a single, unrelenting command. Choose. Docked. Dane stepped closer. His movements slow, deliberate. Harper, listen to me. You've been fighting this the whole time, haven't you? That pull, that voice in the back of your mind. It's you. It's always been you. Tears blurred my vision as I looked at him. My chest tightening with the weight of his words. He was right. I had felt it. Since the moment we crossed into the forest, I'd felt the pull, the whispers, the weight of the obelisk's presence pressing down on me. But I hadn't wanted to believe it. I still didn't. "Can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't." "You have to," Reed said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "If you don't, it won't stop with us. It'll take everything." The obelisk pulsed again, the light blinding now, the carvings on its surface flaring with an intensity that burned into my eyes. The cracks in the ground widened further, the green light spilling out in waves, bathing the clearing in its unearthly glow, and the whispers fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening, oppressive, and the air grew still. The obelisk's light dimmed, its pulse slowing, and for a moment I thought it was over. But then I felt it, the pull. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. He'll COVID, Danny. It was in my chest, my bones, my very soul, dragging me forward toward the obelisk, toward the cracks in the earth. I stumbled, my legs moving without my consent, my body drawn toward the center of the clearing. Dane reached for me, his hand catching my arm, but the pull was too strong. It dragged me forward, the ground beneath my feet trembling with each step, the green light wrapping around me like tendrils of smoke. "Harper," Dane shouted, his voice panicked. "Fight it." I couldn't. The pull was too strong. The weight of the whispers too overwhelming. The obelisk loomed before me now, its surface alive with shifting carvings, its light pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I reached out, my hand trembling, the tips of my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth stone. The moment I touched it, the clearing erupted in light. The green glow flared brighter than ever, consuming everything, swallowing the trees, the ground, the sky. The air burned with energy, the vibrations so intense, I thought my body would shatter under the weight of it. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices blending into a single deafening scream. And then, just as suddenly, it was quiet. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the clearing. I stood in an endless void, the ground beneath me smooth and black, the air cold and still. The obelisk was gone, but its presence remained, heavy and inescapable, pressing down on me from all sides. I wasn't alone. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, shifting and writhing, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive. The whispers were faint now, soft and distant, but they didn't need to be loud. I understood them. I was part of them now. I was the anchor. You will. The air was heavier than I imagined, sticky, oppressive, as though the swamp itself was pressing down on us, weighing us into the ground. Every breath felt like inhaling damp cotton. I glanced at the others through the thick haze of Spanish moss, dangling from the gnarled cypress trees. Their faces mirrored my unease. Stillness of the place wasn't natural. It felt watchful. We had been walking for hours, deeper and deeper into the heart of the Louisiana swamp. What began as an impulsive adventure had turned into something darker, something that clawed at the edges of reason. The further we went, the more the world around us seemed to distort. The water, beneath the rotting wooden planks of the trail, shimmered oddly, reflecting nothing but darkness. No frogs croaked, no birds cried. The silence felt wrong. It started with the smell, a cloying, metallic scent that crept in unnoticed until it was all I could taste. Jessica, the first to falter, had frozen mid-step, her hand flying to her nose. "What is that?" she whispered, barely audible over the suffocating silence. She didn't need to ask. We all smelled it. And then we saw it. The object, or what was left of it, was sprawled across the trail, its edges jagged and unnatural, as though it had been left there for years. Deep cuts scored its surface, each mark precise, deliberate. It looked too deliberate to be random, almost as if someone had placed it there intentionally. I wanted to believe it was just some discarded debris, weathered by time, but the way it gleamed in the dim light unsettled me. Kevin leaned closer, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "We should report this," he muttered, though we all knew there was no signal this deep in the swamp. His words hung there, useless, just like us. I couldn't stop staring at it. It looked staged, as if left for us to find. I felt the eyes on us before I saw the shadow. A figure, barely discernible through the shifting mist, stood just beyond the tree line. It was still, unnervingly so, watching. My breath caught, my chest tightening as a primal fear took hold. The others saw it too. "Auntie, what the hell?" Michael started, his voice barely audible, but the figure didn't react. It simply stood there, shrouded in the fog, an indistinct mass of darkness that seemed to shift when you tried to focus on it. And it moved. Not walking, but gliding, smooth and silent, disappearing into the murk as if it had been nothing but a trick of the light. I didn't realize I was gripping Sarah's arm until she yanked it free. Her wide eyes met mine, her pale face a mirror of my own fear. No one spoke. No one dared to. The trail felt different after that. Every step seemed to echo, the sound bouncing off the dense canopy overhead. The swamp, once a tangled mess of roots and foliage, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap us. Every turn looked the same. We tried to retrace our steps, but it was useless. The landmarks, an old hollowed tree, a cluster of bright orange mushrooms, seemed to shift, appearing where they hadn't been before. The swamp was alive, rearranging itself, and it didn't want us to leave. The sun was sinking now, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed as though they had minds of their own. Agatha's house emerged from the mist like an apparition. We hadn't been looking for it. Hell, we didn't even know it existed. But there it was, leaning precariously to one side, its roof caved in, and walls stained with years of mildew and rot. Michael was the first to step inside. The floor creaked ominously under his weight, the sound breaking the suffocating quiet. The interior was worse than the exterior, cluttered with strange trinkets and yellowed photographs, jars of murky liquid lining the shelves. The smell of decay was overwhelming, a mix of mold and something far worse. Sarah found the book first. It was lying open on a table, its brittle pages covered in a language none of us recognized. The symbols twisted and spiraled, a chaotic mess that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. Kevin reached for it, but Sarah stopped him, her voice sharp. Don't. But it was already too late. Something shifted in the air, a low hum that vibrated through my bones. The candle on the table flickered violently before extinguishing altogether, plunging the room into darkness, and the whispers began. Sunadel, I'll do, soft at first, barely more than a breath against my ear. They grew louder, surrounding us, a cacophony of voices, overlapping in a language I didn't understand, but instinctively feared. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam catching a glimpse of something that wasn't there before. A figure standing in the doorway, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The whispers grew sharper, like the snap of a breaking twig, and then everything went silent again. The silence that followed was even more oppressive than the whispers. It pressed against my skull, filled my ears with a dull, suffocating pressure. I felt the pulse in my throat, a rapid rhythm that echoed the panic swelling in my chest. The flashlight in my trembling hand flickered, the beam weak and unreliable, but it was the only source of light. The figure in the doorway was gone. Or maybe it had never been there, but I couldn't convince myself of that. None of us could. Let's go, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plea. He stepped backward toward the door, the creaking floorboards amplifying every movement, until his flashlight swept across the room, casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift and writhe alive. We followed him in silence, each step hesitant, as though the air itself was pushing back. The swamp outside felt different now, darker, thicker, as if the shadows of the house had bled into the world beyond. The air buzzed faintly, like an electric current coursing through the atmosphere. And every so often, I thought I heard something. Branches snapping, water rippling. But I could never pinpoint the source. Jessica stumbled, her foot catching on a root that hadn't been there before. "You," she cursed under her breath. But as she straightened, her face went pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice shaking. We stopped. At first I heard nothing, just the pounding of my heart and the faint rustle of the swamp. "You will," but then it came, a low, rhythmic sound, almost like chanting, carried on the breeze. It was distant, indistinct, but unmistakably human, or something pretending to be. Kevin turned in slow circles, his flashlight scanning the trees. "Where is it coming from?" he asked, but no one answered. The sound was all around us, echoing off the water and twisting through the air in a way that made it impossible to locate. It was Sarah who saw it first. Her sharp intake of breath drew our attention to the trail ahead. The dirt path was no longer empty. A figure stood there, partially obscured by the fog. It wasn't the same as the one we'd seen earlier. "Show me there." This one was smaller, hunched over, and its limbs moved in strange, jerky motions. Its head tilted toward us, the features indistinct but undeniably wrong. "Who's there?" Michael called out, his voice cracking. He raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the mist, but the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, swaying slightly, its silhouette trembling as though it wasn't entirely solid. Then it moved. Oh, not toward us. No, that would have been easier to understand. Instead, it turned abruptly and sprinted into the trees, its movements erratic and unnatural. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, as if spurred on by its retreat. Without thinking, Kevin bolted after it. "Kevin!" Zara shouted, her voice shrill with panic. She grabbed at his arm, but he shook her off, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the underbrush. We had no choice but to follow. The path was uneven and treacherous, roots and vines clawing at our ankles, as if trying to pull us down. The chanting was deafening now, surrounding us, filling the air with a sinister energy that made my skin crawl. We caught up to Kevin in a small clearing. End of speech. He was standing still, his flashlight pointed at something on the ground. As we approached, I saw what had stopped him. A circle of stones, perfectly arranged, surrounding a shallow depression filled with murky water. Symbols were carved into each stone, their edges worn but still visible, and in the center of the circle lay a single rusted object, an old tarnished pendant. Kevin reached for it. "Don't," Sarah hissed, grabbing his arm. "Leave it alone." But Kevin didn't listen. His fingers brushed the surface of the pendant, and the moment he touched it, the air changed. The chanting stopped abruptly. leaving a vacuum of sound that made my ears ring. The shadows around the clearing seemed to stretch, their edges sharp and menacing. "Kevin," I said, my voice barely audible. He turned to face me, but his expression was vacant, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he staggered backward, clutching his head, and let out a strangled gasp. We rushed to him, but before we could reach him, the ground beneath the circle began to shift. The stones trembled, and the water in the center bubbled violently, sending up thick plumes of black smoke that smelled acrid and metallic. And then the whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. They weren't just in the air. They were in my head, crawling through my thoughts, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow knew was wrong. Kevin dropped the pendant, his hand shaking, and as it hit the ground, the chanting returned, louder and more chaotic than before. The smoke coiled upward, forming vague shapes that twisted and writhed, their edges dissolving into the night. "Run," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." But my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the shifting shapes in the smoke. They were human, or close enough to pass as human. But there was something deeply unsettling about the way they moved, their limbs bending at impossible angles. "Run, Lee, Wendy," Michael shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me away. I stumbled after him, my flashlight swinging wildly, its beam catching glimpses of the chaos behind us. The chanting followed us, relentless, and the whispers burrowed deeper into my mind with every step. The swamp seemed to close in around us as we ran, the trees leaning closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path was gone. There was no path anymore, just endless, suffocating darkness. And somewhere in that darkness, the whispers and chanting continued, growing louder, more frantic, as if whatever we had disturbed was chasing us. I don't know how long we ran. Time didn't feel real anymore, just a series of panicked breaths and snapping branches beneath our feet. The chanting still echoed in my head, even after it seemed to fade from the air around us. It was as if the sound had burrowed into my skull, twisting and looping endlessly. The others were just shadows moving ahead of me, their flashlights bobbing like fireflies in the dense, suffocating dark. The ground beneath us grew softer, the muck pulling at my boots with every step. It felt like the swamp was trying to swallow us whole. Then, suddenly, we broke through the trees and stumbled onto a stretch of higher ground. The area was small, barely large enough for the four of us to catch our breath. Gnarled roots jutted out of the earth like skeletal fingers, and a dead tree loomed overhead, its branches stripped bare and clawing at the sky. Kevin dropped to his knees, gasping, his hands still clutching his head. I knelt beside him, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through my rib. "Kevin," I said, shaking his shoulder. "You would. What's happening?" What did you see? He didn't answer. His eyes were wide, staring at something only he could see. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Look, Sarah whispered, and I followed her gaze. The pendant Kevin had dropped was back. It lay in the center of the clearing, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, as if it had followed us. No, Jessica said, her voice trembling. That's impossible. We left it. It doesn't matter, Sarah snapped. We can't stay here. But even as she said it, I could feel the pull of the pendant. It was subtle at first, like a low hum at the edge of my awareness, but it grew stronger with every second. I couldn't look away. It wasn't just an object. It felt alive, pulsating with a dark energy that wrapped around my thoughts and tugged at something deep inside me. Stop staring at it, Michael said, stepping between me and the pendant. He reached down and scooped it up, his hand closing around it with a determined finality. If this thing is doing something to us, we can't leave it here. Are you out of your mind? Sarah hissed. We need to get rid of it, not carry it around like some. Before she could finish, the ground beneath us shook. A low rumble reverberated through the clearing, and the dead tree creaked ominously, its branches swaying as if moved by an invisible wind. Go, Michael shouted, shoving the pendant into his pocket. Move. We ran again, the swamp closing in around us once more. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks impossibly wide, their roots twisting across the ground like snakes. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened, clinging to our skin and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And then we saw it. The cabin was different this time. It shouldn't have been there at all. We had run in the opposite direction. But there it was, standing tall and ominous in the fog. The wood was warped and blackened, the windows dark and uninviting. But there was something else too, a faint light flickering inside, like a candle struggling against the darkness. I'm not going back in there, Jessica said, her voice shaking. I don't care what's happening. I'm not. We don't have a choice, Michael interrupted. He pushed the door open, and it groaned loudly in protest. The sound echoed unnaturally, as if the swamp itself were mocking us. Inside, the air was colder than outside, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The shelves that had once held jars were empty now, their surfaces coated in a thick layer of grime. The table in the center of the room was bare, except for a single piece of paper. Michael hesitated, then stepped forward and picked it up. His hands trembled as he unfolded it, and I saw his eyes dart across the page, widening with every word. What does it say? Sarah asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. It's not English, Michael said, his voice unsteady. But I think it's instructions for the pendant. What kind of instructions? I asked, dreading the answer. He didn't respond. Instead, he set the paper down and pulled the pendant from his pocket. The moment he did, the air in the cabin changed. It grew heavier, pressing down on us, and the faint light from the candle flickered violently. "I don't think we're alone," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. She was right. The shadows in the corners of the room were moving, shifting like something was trying to emerge from the darkness. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment I saw them. Figures hunched and twisted, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers started again, louder this time, and the symbols on the pendant began to glow. Mikkel dropped it with a gasp, and it hit the floor with a sharp clink. The shadows surged toward us, their movements quick and erratic, and the cabin walls groaned as if the entire structure was about to collapse. "Run!" Sarah screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The door slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the cabin like a gunshot. And then everything went dark. "Suilei, hiu, die dark." The darkness was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a suffocating void that pressed against my skin and wrapped itself around my thoughts. My breathing felt too loud, my heartbeat too erratic. Somewhere nearby, I heard someone whispering my name. Not one of the others, but a voice that was unfamiliar, cold and hollow. I clenched my fists, grounding myself in the sensation of my nails digging into my palms. "Stay calm," I muttered under my breath, though I doubted anyone could hear me. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. It clung to my skin, making every shallow breath feel like an effort. A faint light bloomed in the center of the cabin, flickering weakly at first, then growing stronger. It wasn't from a flashlight or the candle. It came from the pendant. It lay where Michael had dropped it, glowing faintly, its carved symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. The air around it shimmered, distorted, and the shadows that had surged toward us seemed to recoil, shrinking back into the corners. "Do you see that?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cracked with tension. She was close, her figure just barely visible in the dim glow. Before I could answer, the floor beneath us trembled. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating through my chest and making my teeth ache. The walls groaned as if under immense pressure, and the shadows began to move again, slithering along the edges of the room, their shapes stretching and twisting unnaturally. Michael took a step forward, his gaze locked on the pendant. His face was pale, sweat dripping down his temples. But there was something else in his expression, a strange mix of fear and fascination. "It's drawing them," he said, his voice trembling. "Whatever they are, they're connected to it." "No?" Sarah said sharply, grabbing his arm. "We have to get rid of it. Bury it. Throw it in the swamp. Anything. It's not safe." But Michael shook his head. "You saw what happened when I touched it. If we try to get rid of it without understanding what it is, it might make things worse." Before she could argue, the hum intensified, and a sharp crack split the air. One of the wooden beams overhead snapped, crashing to the floor and sending splinters flying. I ducked instinctively, my heart pounding in my ears. When I looked up, the glow from the pendant had grown brighter, casting eerie, shifting patterns across the walls. The symbols on the pendant weren't just glowing, they were moving. They were moving. They twisted and spiraled, rearranging themselves into new patterns that I couldn't comprehend but felt drawn to. My stomach churned, and I tore my eyes away, but the image was burned into my mind. "We have to leave," Jessica said, her voice trembling. She was standing by the door, her hands pressed against the rough wood, as if trying to will it open. "No, before this place." Her words were cut off by a sudden piercing sound, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. You were so scary. It was something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl and my thoughts scatter. The shadows lunged. They moved like liquid, flowing across the floor and walls with impossible speed. One of them surged toward Jessica, wrapping around her legs and pulling her to the ground. She screamed, kicking and clawing at the dark tendrils, but they clung to her like tar. "Help me," she cried, her voice raw with panic. Michael and I lunged forward at the same time, grabbing her arms and pulling with all our strength. The shadows resisted, their grip tightening, but as the light from the pendant flared brighter, they seemed to weaken. With one final tug, we pulled her free, and she scrambled backward, her breaths ragged. The shadows didn't retreat. They hovered just beyond the reach of the pendant's glow, shifting and writhing as though waiting for an opportunity to strike again. "We can't fight this," I said, my voice shaking. "Henda, we need to figure out how to stop it." Sarah pointed to the paper Michael had found earlier. It had been blown to the floor in the chaos, but it was still intact. "There has to be something in there," she said. "Something about what it wants." Tiama. Michael grabbed the paper, his hands trembling as he scanned the symbols. "It's instructions," he said again, his voice low. "But they're not clear. It's like it's half a ritual or half a warning. I can't tell which." The pendant pulsed again, and the shadows flinched, their edges blurring as if they were being stretched too thin. For a moment, the wailing sound subsided, replaced by a low, rhythmic chanting, faint but growing louder with every pulse of light. "It's reacting to us," Sarah said. "To what we're doing. Whatever this is, it knows we're trying to stop it." Michael's eyes narrowed as he stared at the paper, then at the pendant. "There's something missing," he said, almost to himself. "Something we don't have." Another beam snapped overhead, and the entire cabin groaned as if it were about to collapse. The shadows surged forward again, and this time the pendant's light flickered, dimming for just a moment. But it was enough. The shadows moved closer, their tendrils reaching for us, their forms growing more solid. "Michael, Mika," I shouted. "Aye, what do we do?" His eyes darted back to the paper, then to the pendant, and then to us. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. "This place isn't safe. We can't finish this here." Without waiting for a response, he grabbed the pendant, the light flaring painfully bright as his fingers closed around it. The shadows recoiled, hissing like steam, and for a brief moment, the chanting stopped. "Let's go," he said, his voice grim, and with that, we plunged back into the darkness. The swamp swallowed us as soon as we stepped out of the cabin. The thick mist clung to my skin, making it hard to tell where my sweat ended and the dampness of the air began. The ground beneath us squelched with every step, water seeping into my boots and pulling at my ankles like it wanted me to stop. The pendant in Michael's hand glowed faintly, the symbols flickering as though they were alive. The shadows were gone for now, but I could feel them. Watching, waiting. Jessica was the first to break the silence. "Where are we even going?" Her voice cracked, her breathing heavy. "This swamp is endless. We're just running in circles." "We don't have a choice," Michael said. He didn't turn to face her. "They would be gonna there." His flashlight beam cut through the fog, but it was weak, barely illuminating the path ahead. "If we stay still, we're dead." "Dead?" Jessica snapped. "What does that even mean? What's chasing us? What is this thing?" She gestured toward the pendant, her hand trembling. "It doesn't matter," Sarah interjected, her voice sharp. "Arguing won't help. Just keep moving." The tension between us was as thick as the mist. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the distant ripple of water, made me flinch. The swamp was alive, but it wasn't the kind of life I understood. It was watching, shifting, guiding us deeper into its heart. We came to a fork in the trail, the two paths disappearing into the fog like veins, leading into the unknown. Michael hesitated, his hand tightening around the pendant. The light from it dimmed, then flared, pointing toward the left path, like it was making the choice for us. "This way," he said, his voice steady despite the fear that lingered just beneath the surface. The left path was narrower, the trees closing in around us, like skeletal hands. The air grew colder, and the buzzing sound I had felt back in the cabin returned, vibrating through my skull. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something ahead, a shape, pale and distorted, standing motionless between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. No one else said anything. Maybe they had seen it too, or maybe they were too afraid to admit it. Either way, we pressed on. The ground grew softer, the mud sucking at our feet. With every step, my legs ached, my chest burned, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than the pain. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see the shadows chasing us, but the path was empty, still. The sensation of being followed clung to me like a second skin. We reached a clearing, the trees opening up to reveal a shallow pool of black water. The surface was unnaturally still, like glass, reflecting the twisted branches above. The pendant's light grew brighter, illuminating a series of symbols carved into the ground around the pool. They matched the ones on the pendant, their edges sharp and deliberate, as if they had been freshly etched. "This is it," Michael said, stopping at the edge of the pool. "And this is what it's been leading us to. Are you insane?" "Jessica," said her voice, rising, "you want to stay here after everything we've seen? This place, this thing, it's not going to save us. It's not about saving us." Michael interrupted. He knelt down, holding the pendant above the pool. The water rippled as though responding to its presence. "It's about stopping it, whatever it is." Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "What do we have to do?" Michael glanced at the paper, still clutched in his other hand. His eyes scanned the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's a ritual," he said finally, "but it's incomplete. We need something." "What something?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We don't have time to guess." "Hull." Michael didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small knife. The blade caught the faint light of the pendant, glinting like an accusation. "No," Sarah said, stepping back. "Absolutely not. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Michael said, his voice cold. "It's the only way to complete the ritual. It needs an offering." Jessica's breathing quickened, her eyes darting between the knife and the pool. "You're talking about blood. This is insane." Before anyone could stop him, Michael pressed the blade against his palm and dragged it across his skin. The cut wasn't deep, but it was enough to draw a line of crimson. He held his hand over the pool, letting the blood drip into the water. The reaction was immediate. The symbols around the pool began to glow, their edges pulsing with the same rhythm as the pendant. The water rippled violently, the surface breaking apart to reveal a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The hum in the air grew louder, resonating through my entire body. And then the voices started. They weren't whispers anymore. They were loud, overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but instinctively feared. The vortex in the pool expanded, the shadows within it twisting and writhing like living things. The symbols on the pendant flared, and the shadows from the pool surged outward, spreading across the clearing like ink spilling across a page. "Michael!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. He was frozen, his eyes locked on the vortex, his face pale and blank. The pendant in his hand burned brighter, and the shadows surged toward him, their forms growing more solid with every second. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back, and the motion broke whatever trance he was in. The pendant's light dimmed, the shadows recoiling slightly, but they didn't disappear. They hovered at the edges of the clearing, waiting watching. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "No." But the shadows didn't give us a choice. They surged forward again, faster this time, their forms coiling and stretching as they reached for us. The vortex in the pool roared, and the ground beneath us trembled. And then, without warning, the clearing went dark. The darkness was suffocating, thicker than anything I'd ever felt before. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence, something alive and consuming. I reached out blindly, desperate to feel the others, to know I wasn't alone. But the air around me felt wrong. Too dense, too cold. A sharp sound cracked through the void, like a branch snapping underfoot. And then, a faint light flickered to life. It wasn't the pendant. It was Michael's flashlight, its beam weak and erratic, cutting feebly through the darkness. His face appeared out of the void, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide and wild. "Where are we?" "Gained," I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. My voice sounded small, swallowed almost immediately by the oppressive blackness. Michael didn't respond. His attention was locked on something just beyond the reach of his light. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach twist. The vortex was still there, its swirling mass of shadows and light suspended in midair, as though the ground had vanished beneath it. The symbols that had been etched around the pool were now glowing faintly in the air, hovering like ghostly runes. "Is everyone here?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence, sharp and shaking. She was to my left, her silhouette barely visible in the faint glow. "Jessica, Kevin, I'm here," Jessica said from somewhere behind me, her voice strained. "What happened? Where's Kevin?" The realization hit like a punch to the gut. Kevin wasn't there. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the dark, but there was no sign of him, only more shadows, shifting and stretching like they were alive. "He was right behind us," Jessica said, panic rising in her voice. "I saw him. He was..." "Quiet," Michael hissed, cutting her off. "Listen." We all froze, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. And then we heard it. A faint sound, barely more than a whisper, coming from somewhere in the distance. It wasn't the chanting this time. Envelop. It was a voice, weak and fragmented, but unmistakably human. "It's Kevin," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "We have to find him." "No," Michael said firmly. "It might not be him. We don't know what's out there." Jessica stepped forward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "We can't just leave him. If that's Kevin, he's..." Her words were cut off by a sudden, piercing cry that echoed through the void. It was Kevin's voice, raw and desperate, filled with a kind of fear that made my blood run cold. "Help me," he screamed, his voice breaking. "Please, someone." Without thinking, I ran. The sound of his voice pulled me forward, cutting through my fear like a knife. I heard the others shouting behind me, telling me to stop. But I couldn't. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I stumbled through the dark. The ground uneven and slick beneath my feet. "Kevin," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Where are you?" The shadows seemed to close in around me, their shapes twisting and shifting, but I didn't stop. The faint glow of the pendant in Michael's hand was gone now, swallowed by the dark. The only light came from my flashlight, its beam dim and faltering. And then I saw him. Kevin was lying on the ground, his body curled in on itself, his hands clutching his head. His flashlight was on the ground beside him, its beam pointed upward, casting strange, jagged shadows on the trees above. His lips were moving, but the words were too quiet to hear. "Kevin." I dropped to my knees beside him, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "Aim to do, boy. Stanung. And his skin was cold, clammy, and he flinched at my touch, his eyes snapping open. "They're inside my head," he whispered, his voice shaking. I can't make them stop." Before I could respond, a low, guttural sound rumbled through the air, like a growl reverberating from deep within the earth. Kevin's eyes widened, and he grabbed my arm with a strength that startled me. "They're coming," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have to go." I pulled him to his feet, and we stumbled back toward the others. "You do it." The growling sound grew louder, more distinct, and I could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath us. The shadows around us shifted, converging on the vortex, their forms coiling and writhing like snakes. When we reached the others, Michael was standing at the edge of the clearing, the pendant glowing brightly in his hand. The symbols were moving again, their edges blurring as they rearranged themselves into new patterns. "And what are you doing?" "What?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "I think I know what it wants," he said, his gaze locked on the vortex. "It's not just a passage. It's a gate." "A gate to what?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with dread. Michael didn't answer. He stepped closer to the vortex, the light from the pendant flaring brighter with each step. The growling sound intensified, and the shadows surged forward, their movements frantic and chaotic. "Stop. Really? Stop," Jessica shouted, grabbing his arm. "You don't know what you're doing." Michael turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "If we don't do this, it's not going to let us go. We'll be trapped here forever, before anyone could stop him." He stepped into the vortex. The light from the pendant exploded outward, blinding and brilliant, and the ground beneath us shook violently. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed us again was Michael's silhouette, standing at the center of the swirling chaos, the pendant blazing like a star in his hand. The light was so intense, I thought it might burn straight through me. It wasn't just brightness, it was everything. Heat, sound, pressure. It felt like the entire world had been compressed into that single blinding point, and then it shattered. The ground beneath me gave way, and I was falling, plunging through an endless void, my stomach lurching as gravity twisted into something unrecognizable. When I hit the ground, the impact knocked the air from my lungs. My vision blurred, and my ears rang with the deafening silence that followed. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was lie there, staring up at a sky that wasn't a sky at all. A swirling mass of black and gray, alive with faint flashes of light, like distant stars being born and dying in the same instant. "Get up!" Sarah's voice cut through the haze, sharp and urgent. Her hands gripped my arms, pulling me to my feet. My legs felt like jelly, but I managed to stand, swaying unsteadily. The others were there too, Jessica clutching her flashlight like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. Kevin leaning heavily against a jagged outcrop of rock, his face pale and drawn, but Michael was gone. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Ah, where's Michael?" Sarah shook her head, her expression grim. "He went through. I saw him. He just disappeared." The landscape around us was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was both vast and claustrophobic, a twisted expanse of jagged rocks and shifting shadows that seemed to go on forever. The ground beneath us was a strange glassy surface that reflected faint images of ourselves, warped and fractured like broken mirrors. The pendant lay at the center of it all, glowing faintly. Its light was dimmer now, pulsing weakly like a dying heartbeat. The symbols on its surface had stopped moving, frozen in place, but they still radiated a sense of unease, as though they were watching us. "What is this place?" Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. Where are we?" Kevin's gaze was fixed on the pendant. "You to say it's not a place," he said quietly. "Envelop, deep Shen, quietly. It's something else. A threshold." "A threshold to what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath the pendant began to crack. Thin lines spread outward, jagged and sharp, emitting a faint, eerie glow. The air grew heavier, and the hum I'd felt earlier returned, vibrating through my bones. And then I saw them. No, the shadows weren't just shadows anymore. They had form now, their edges solidifying as they emerged from the cracks in the ground. They were tall and thin, their movements jerky and unnatural, their faces featureless, except for the faint glow of their eyes, pale and empty, like twin moons reflected on dark water. "Run!" Sarah shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me backward. The others followed, stumbling across the uneven ground as the figures advanced. They didn't run. They didn't need to. Their movements were slow but relentless, their long limbs stretching and bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. We ran, but there was no direction to run to. The landscape was endless, looping in on itself like a cruel joke. No matter how far we went, the shadows were always there, closing in their presence suffocating. Kevin stumbled and fell, his flashlight skittering across the ground. One of the figures lunged toward him, its arm stretching impossibly long, its fingers curling like claws. I didn't think. I just acted. Grabbing a loose shard of rock from the ground, I swung it with all my strength, the sharp edge slicing through the figure's arm. It recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it turned its gaze to me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its eyes. Recognition, or maybe hunger. My stomach churned, and I stumbled backward, dragging Kevin to his feet. "We can keep running," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. It's the pendant. It brought us here. It's the only thing that can get us out." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. She was right, but the thought of going back, of touching that thing again, made my skin crawl. Still, there was no other choice. The figures were closer now, their movements more fluid, their forms becoming sharper with each passing second. We couldn't outrun them. We couldn't fight them. The only chance we had was to finish what Michael started. The pendant was still glowing, faint but steady at the center of the cracks. The ground around it pulsed with the same eerie light, as though the two were connected. Sarah reached it first, dropping to her knees beside it. Her hands hovered over the pendant, trembling. "It needs more," she said, her voice barely audible. "It needs another offering." "No," Jessica said, shaking her head. "We can't. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Sarah said, her voice breaking. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with fear and determination. "It's the only way to close the gate." Before I could respond, she picked up the pendant. The light flared, and the shadows shrieked, their forms distorting as though the light was burning them. The cracks in the ground spread wider, and the air around us grew hotter, thicker. Sarah looked at me one last time. "Don't let this be for nothing," she said, and then she pressed the pendant to her chest. "I would like to and do the She pushed the pendant to her chest. The light exploded outward, blinding and all-consuming. I felt the ground beneath me give way again. Felt the heat and the pressure and the noise all at once. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes, the swamp was back. The fog, the trees, the stillness. It was all the same as before. But Sarah was gone. So was the pendant. The others were there, silent and shaken, their faces pale and hollow. No one spoke. We didn't need to. We knew we would never be the same. We knew we would never be the same. As we made our way back to the edge of the swamp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped, that somewhere, deep in the darkness, the shadows were still watching, waiting. Why?